Hello, welcome back to TSC Talks, the podcast inspired by the condition known as tuberous sclerosis complex. My name is Jill Woodworth, and I am your host. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am going to try something a little different here. I'm going to do a bit of an intro and announce recent guests and upcoming guests, and fill you in on any information that might be relevant to help you understand what we're doing here at TSC Talks. So bear with me. I'm a little stuttery, but I will do my best to get through this. And again, thank you so much for tuning in and staying with us, supporting the podcast. I think in the recent months, I've had challenges with my daughter who has TSC, related to some placement issues, and just been once again reminded of the fragility of life and how quickly things can turn on a dime for all of us, particularly when you're dependent on a lot of systems of care, as we are frequently with TSC management, whether we are affected or our loved ones are affected. It's challenging, and my biggest reason for starting this podcast, well, one of them was meeting you all at the World Conference and feeling a connection with the TSC moms, and kind of circling back to my own experience having children affected by TSC, and my oldest daughter now really struggling kind of in that transition to adulthood and flopping around through the systems of care and trying to ride these waves as she is, and just feeling overwhelmed a lot, and focusing on the podcast, which has been wonderful. And I'm not going to keep talking about that, just to mention that my deep desire to find better ways to manage TSC care and collaborate, consistently across a lifetime, I think is of utmost importance, and has fueled a lot of the interviews that I've had. I feel like I can make a connection with the guests on some level. We have some relatability, and I love engaging with people's stories and hearing what's different from what I've experienced, and learning and putting that information out there for you. And I think the more that we're willing to do that and be honest and share what's worked for us, what's been frustrating, not in a adversarial way, but collaboratively, really not turning away from these really messy, complicated lives that some of us end up in, personally speaking, and just kind of chipping away at what we can do in the here and now, keeping track of the history, not projecting into the future, and keep it on. So also that ties in with cannabis, the study we're doing to do some safety testing and put together a family cannabis guidebook. I think I'm in a lot of ways with my kids still. I'm involved in their case management with their pharmaceuticals, and it's an overwhelming task that never ends, and teaching them to do it has taught me a lot. Also just really concerned about the long-term impact of all these meds that no one seems to have exact information about, and seeing and hearing about a lot of success that people are having treating some of the symptoms of autism with cannabis, mental health issues with cannabis, having had a personal experience where I was able to reduce the number of pharmaceuticals I prescribed, and seeing improvements in physical and mental health, but also knowing there's a lot of restriction and fear and confusion and a concern over using cannabis, and putting a guidebook out there from the perspective of lived experience, but calling on the experts and interviewing as many people as possible in the cannabis industry, which we are just going great guns at this, as you're going to hear when you hear about our guests. So, kind of pulling all that together and hoping that we can find a way to have some protocols, or at least more attention to cannabis for TSC And I'm not suggesting it as a panacea or a magic pill, but a tool in the toolbox that I feel like we cannot wait for these pharmaceutical isolates. While they may be wonderful in many ways, waiting around another 10 years till we have the perfect pill or formulation, when there are a lot of people that know a lot more about it than I do, and we're all still learning about the endocannabinoid system and cannabinoids in general. Let's get going on this. So that's part of the crowdfunder, and I would appreciate your sharing the information about that. And if you have a couple bucks, throwing it our way. I think this is going to be our 70th podcast, and I have a team of people volunteering their time to put this out there, and we're trying to bring something like a product to you guys. So this guidebook is going to be really great, and we've got some great guests that we've already talked to. Back in a few episodes, we had Shelley Metzler, who is a TSC hero, mom of 3, 2 with TSC, community programs manager. She shared one of the most riveting stories about the shaken baby syndrome as her daughter was having seizures and having to go through the ordeal of being accused of that. And that kind of started out that podcast. It's an excellent look at lived experience. Then moving on to Daniela Benea, who is a pharmacist at a medical marijuana dispensary in Connecticut and Mass, talking really practically speaking about, just detoxifying the process and talking about the people that she works with and the individual attention she gets to give in the dispensary setting as opposed to a regular pharmacy, and the successes that she's seen, major success. And then moving on from there to Marijuana Mommy, which was really great as well. Jessie Gill kind of also stepping out of her comfort zone and putting information out there about her experience and how she got to, the bottom, desperate and really not wanting to use cannabis. And then it kind of really, for a spinal injury that was not being treated by conventional medicine, and really experiencing amazing results and getting into cannabis nursing. So that connection was amazing because she gave me names of more cannabis nurses. So Jessie, another great guest. They're all great guests. And I feel like I just love every one of you in some way, shape, or form. I'm glad our paths crossed. And then most recently, Spectrum sports and fitness programs for autism and intellectual disability. This team of 3 that kind of busted out and started their own program based on what they saw as a gap in access to social and fitness related activities with the typical inclusive environment, and created this program in their local community, developing it into a regular program where you can kind of connect with other parents and get your kids involved in activities, and kind of a wide age range on that. And I give them props for just kind of doing it all on their own, working full time in their special ed department in their high school. Great episode. So, and coming up, I have Steve Kelley, who I am going to introduce in a second. But after Steve, I have Kevin Green, who is involved with Cleveland School of Cannabis, a really interesting program going on in the state of Ohio. He talks about that, what's unique about their program, where they have an online component and they also have the brick and mortar. And Kevin just talks about what an opportunity this is, as well as the fact that their company, their school, they offer a lot of scholarships or grants, or I'm not sure what they are, endowments, but some financial aid packages. And they really aim to place in dispensaries or in the cannabis industry at all levels their graduates or the people that take classes from Cleveland School of Cannabis. So he is coming down the pike. And we also have Stacy Jackson, who's been hanging out there waiting for us to find space in our cannabis study, and I appreciate her patience because hers is an equally awesome podcast updating us about her daughter and her out-of-district placement that she's had to advocate not in an adversarial way, in a very kind of wealthy suburban school district in Massachusetts, and playing both sides, being on a school committee member. So that's going to be an interesting update. And we've got Russell Cole, who works in the cannabis industry, started the company Organic Grow Solutions, and has really a novel business there with some drones and what they're doing with technology related to cannabis growing. Dr. Mary Clifton, who is great. She recently contacted me. She does a lot of work on YouTube, putting together videos about and educated about cannabinoid medicine and CBD. As a physician, I enjoyed meeting her and talking to her and hearing about what she's trying to do to give cannabis legitimacy from the medical perspective. And then we have Gianna Champaign, another amazing guest. She is a cannabis nurse, and she is in Oregon, a leader, a writer. She has a practice integrating nutrition and genetics and cannabis as medicine. Also has a daughter on the autism spectrum who she has had success using cannabis with, and is getting funding to implement a program in her home using ABA therapy and cannabinoid medicine. So phenomenal. And Cannamoms. This one I just did yesterday. I talked to these two ladies, Joyce Gerber and Amy Searles in Massachusetts. They busted out and started this cannabis podcast. I actually wanted to do with a couple of my friends a few years back. Didn't work out. We weren't quite as progressive in our thinking, and it just can go south in a lot of ways, and give them a lot of props for having the bravery to step out. And they are interviewing a lot of women across the industry as well, and getting the stories out of these moms or that have had success using cannabis and what they've had to overcome and how it's kind of shifted and changed and enriched their lives. So a great episode is in production there. And Marissa Frattoni, she is another cannabis nurse. A holistic nurse mama is her blog. I just talked with her yesterday, and she works with a lot of people who want to use cannabis for medicinal reasons. She also is experienced as a yoga teacher and has a consulting business. So great one. So keep tuning in. I think TSC Talks, I can relate to Steve Kelley on a very low, humble way. Steve is the president and CEO of Ellenville Regional Hospital. He came to the healthcare industry from more of an IT outside the industry, and has this way of getting things done and questioning the status quo, and how he motivates the entire hospital staff to do that. He gives us some thoughts here about the healthcare industry in general, and we also talk about his involvement with Nicky's Gardens of Hope as a member of the board of directors. So we have more on Steve. We're just doing not a long piece, but I did want to add this intro on to fill you in about what's going on. TSC Talks similarly, kind of working from outside the system and trying to affect change. For us, it's small incremental ways. It's having a guest on the podcast who's willing to talk about bad experiences they've had. It's exploring new progressive ideas such as polyvagal theory, like Caroline Clybourne. It's just the bravery of the women and the men and all the professionals that have been on and have been willing to put information out there that's, not necessarily controversial, but can put you in a vulnerable place. So I thank you all, and keep tuning in, and thanks again. Take it away, Steve.
My background is I'm on my third career. My first career was in IT. I worked for IBM. I worked for Control Data. And then I was an entrepreneur in the IT field. That was my first career. And I worked as an integrator, integrating computer systems and application software and implementation, modification, training, all those kinds of things to develop solutions for customers around accounting, financial, manufacturing, and different types of vertical markets like that.
Okay.
Manufacturing, construction, development. So I was very, very involved in really an industry doing that kind of work.
Okay.
Outdoor data collection systems, all kinds of cool stuff. And then I went back to school and retooled for healthcare, and I wasn't able to get a job at first in healthcare because I didn't have any experience.
What made you go back and go back to school or whatnot to do that?
Well, I was really quite successful doing what I was doing in IT. And I visited my 90-some-year-old grandfather, and I was telling him how successful I was, how I had really nice clothes, and I I wore suspenders, and I had a new car, and I took great vacations. I owned a house before I was 25. I did kind of the world by the tail. But my grandfather was a farmer and a Presbyterian minister, and any money that he ever made, he gave away because he thought other people needed it more. And all of my efforts to impress him all they did is turned him off.
Really?
Finally, he said to me, he said, "Well, Steve, I'm very disappointed in you, but I have great faith in God. And maybe your children or your grandchildren will amount to something."
Wow. Yeah.
So at first I was very angry and insulted, and I was in my late 20s by then. And then he passed away, and it grated on me, and I decided to change careers. I'm a nurse, so I went back to school. I got an MBA in health systems management, MBA health, and I went into research after that. I worked at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute as a research scientist, and helped to develop the reimbursement system for nursing homes called RUGS, which is Resource Utilization Groups. So we did a study in nursing homes, in 85 nursing homes, and we had a clinical assessment of the residents who lived there. And then we did a resource consumption, which means cost. So we did time studies of everybody that spent time with the residents and how much everything cost. And then there were statisticians that put those two data sets together and figured out what were the clinical conditions that predicted cost and modeled them and stratified them. And that became the reimbursement system that's been in place for probably 25 years. And then some folks from the health department liked me, and they tapped me to be the principal investigator, which is a whole lot better than being a grunt research scientist. Yeah. To do a similar project around emergency department visits. Okay. And I worked on that for 3 years, and it was very cool. But then we had a change in the governor's mansion, and the new governor felt about everything that the old governor did, pretty much like the current president feels about everything that the old president did. Okay. So my research was truncated, and it never got finished. But I learned an awful lot about ERs, and I always promised myself if I ever got the chance, I would fix it. So I decided I was a little discouraged because, my children had gotten used to eating every day and things like that. So I had to do a different job. So I decided to go into something more reliable than grant-funded research. Okay. I decided I would go into healthcare administration, only to discover that that's not very safe either. So you jumped from the research into the administration. Now, did you have to go back and get more training for that or education, or were you able to just... I called up the CEO of a hospital and convinced him to create a job for me. Did you? Yep. So he sold half of my time to a group of doctors that owned a surgical center. Okay. That needed an administrator. And then I reported to him, and I did special projects for him in the other half of the time. So one of the projects that I worked on was representing Kingston Hospital, my employer, in bankruptcy court for another hospital, Ellenville Hospital, where we had loaned them resources that they never paid for, and so they owed us $379,000 or something like that. And I represented Kingston in bankruptcy court and became the chairman of the creditors committee and sold the hospital to Westchester. And no good deed goes unpunished. And so a few years later, when Westchester was looking for someone to blame when the hospital closed, they entered into a management agreement with Kingston, who sent me down here to be the CEO, and I'm still here. Oh, wow. So okay. The hospital was on the verge of closure. It was failing by every account: quality, finances, facilities. By every metric, the place was closing. And we were able to come up with a harebrained scheme And we didn't close, we survived. And now, 15, 16 years later, we are really a top hospital or rural hospital in the country. We speak often around the country on different topics like quality and clinical outcomes and innovation and IT. So we've done really well in a lot of things. We have a lot of education. Every department in the hospital has an education component. So we train nurses and nurse practitioners, which are now doctors. We train physical therapists who are doctors, pharmacists who are doctors, occupational therapists, which aren't doctors yet. We train rad techs of every flavor. We train lab techs. We train high school kids. So we have
incredible
coming in the bottom, and we do all that with no money.
Now,
we train physicians as well. We have residents that rotate through here.
Challenges as you see it with the changing landscape of healthcare and the role of hospitals, kind of give me a broader view of how you see the role of your hospital and as things change.
And it also is an unfair system. We treat, as I say, we value working people more than old people and old people more than poor people. And is that necessarily right? We'll always have people at the upper end who will pay for their own health care or their own everything. So we're not as worried about that, small percentage.
Right.
People aren't in that. We have a lot of poor people in our country and a lot of middle class people, hardworking, regular folks who need health care. Their children need education. And this is like part of the problem with rural areas. It costs more to educate kids in rural areas because you've got all the transportation issues.
Mm-hmm.
And healthcare is more expensive in rural areas because we don't have the volume to spread transactions over. So if I had an MRI in a rural area like I do, I'm not able to generate as much volume as I would in an urban area where there's a lot more people getting MRIs. So therefore, the cost per MRI really is more because I can't spread the cost over as many transactions. And so what we hear often is, well, we're paying too much in rural areas, and so we should cut that. And I would say, well, maybe we should cut education also and only educate people to the 6th grade in rural areas because it's more expensive. I mean, it's the same argument.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah, people aren't thinking through the whole part of it. Yeah,
it makes no sense at all. Of course, it's going to be a little more expensive for things where you have low volume hospitals and low volume communities. And it isn't right that people should have to travel hours for education or for healthcare. It just isn't right. We should be able to provide that in a civilized country.
Yeah.
So I'm involved in policy issues.
Okay.
We have our congressman visiting us on Monday. I speak a lot at conferences and those are areas that I talk about. Because we need to figure out how to be efficient anyway, and we need to figure out how we can be successful and profitable. Because if you're unprofitable, then your quality will eventually erode. When your quality goes down, then your outcomes deteriorate remarkably. People with bad outcomes aren't very happy, and then your financial performance suffers. Conversely, when you're very innovative and you improve your quality, then your outcomes go up and you get sued less and you have really high patient satisfaction, you get sued less and you make more money.
Yeah.
It's not that hard.
Right. No, it's not. It's logical. So what kind of policy are you talking about here? Not to get too
more
segue.
Technical than they're more technical things to find ways to keep business in rural areas that can be done in rural areas. So we're a primary hospital, so we do a lot of rehabilitation. We support the primary care and specialty doctors that can do outpatient surgery. Most surgery now is outpatient. People shouldn't have to travel for outpatient surgery. They should be able to get that locally.
Great.
So we should have incentives to make sure that happens so that people aren't traveling long distance to high-powered medical centers that have very high capital outlays on electrophysiology labs so they can burn holes in your heart to kill the part of your heart that's making your heart beat irregularly so it doesn't pump the blood properly.
Oh boy.
I mean, that's high-tech stuff.
Yeah.
That should be done in a major medical center. It shouldn't be done out in the country.
Yeah.
However, there's all kinds of other things like putting in pacemakers that can be done safely in an outpatient setting. The patient go home that day. Most orthopedic surgery is outpatient today. So figure out how to make sure that business in rural areas stays there.
Okay.
And we can't get that unless we have innovation, quality, high outcomes, and high patient satisfaction. So we need to be able to have best practices to help facilities to do that. And so I talk about that kind of stuff and try to get policies that support that.
That's great. I'm impressed to hear this.
Come around to Nicky's garden.
Yeah.
That is sort of what you wanted to talk about.
Yes, it is. Well, I did want to get all this information. It's helpful for everybody that deals with hospitals on a regular basis. And a lot of the people that listen to the podcast do that. So it's helpful.
So I'm an entrepreneur. I can think of myself as an entrepreneur. I've owned businesses before. And so now, thanks to my grandfather, I use my entrepreneurial
mojo,
expertise, mojo, whatever, in a not-for-profit sector. I work for a board of trustees who hire me to run their hospital for them. And so I think of myself as an entrepreneur. I do have bosses, but they've been very generous to give me a lot of freedom to try stuff. And I wouldn't tell you that everything works because nobody, that's just not true.
Right.
But we're small enough so that if it doesn't work, we can stop doing it before it does any damage. And we can try to do something different to steer ourselves onto a better course.
Okay.
So Nicky's Garden, I do a lot of work with folks who are interested in doing projects, economic development.
Okay.
And the county economic development officer suggested that they talk to me because they were talking about doing this project. And so I work with people, quite a bit actually, who are interested in that because I'm an entrepreneur. I'm interested in startups. I'm interested in interesting things. I'm interested in
new things, progress.
Trying to figure out how to do things better. And when I met with Adriana and company and Chris and the whole team, I was captivated with this is a real problem. Autism is a growing problem, and nobody really understands why we have all this autism. And it's been growing really exponentially over the last maybe 30 or 40 years. It's always been there, but it never was at the rate that it is now. And as it has become apparent, we've had parents who have been able to advocate and get the laws changed so that their children are cared for through the school system. So they get all kinds of services. It varies from district to district, but progressive districts have a lot of services for children with autism. And then when they are no longer eligible for public schools, which I think is 21 or somewhere around there.
22.
Okay, again, this is not my area of expertise.
No, I know. It is. I do know a little bit about this area, but
22 it is. I'm not arguing with you.
No, I know.
And at some point, they reach the end of the resources.
Right.
And then there are no more resources.
Right. Well, there are resources. They're just, a lot of them are income dependent and they're very siloed. They're all over the place and they don't collaborate at all.
You are right. There are agencies that do care for autistic people.
It's tough, though.
It is tough. Like their model, I thought that the idea of having a more integrated program instead, and I've done volunteer work. I'm a sit on a lot of boards and have sat on a lot of boards, and one of them was an agency that provides care to people with mental illness.
Okay.
And they had a sheltered workshop, and they had a residential component, and autism and mental illness aren't that far apart.
Oh.
It's somewhat of a different population, but I think that the concept was really good. I really like the idea of people being able to contribute as much as they can towards their own well-being.
Absolutely.
And then we in society have to figure out how to make up the rest. And so the Nicky's Gardens approach is to give people the dignity from that four-letter word of work to contribute to their own well-being as much as they can, and to have programs to kind of help them the rest of the way. And to have that in a very supportive environment, and to have a residential component where they would be able to live, and also have many of the workers, the counselors and so forth, be able to live on that campus, and the parents. Because in many cases, the parents need to have some space so that they are able to live comfortably and have their life back a little bit, because it is so difficult to care for such a needy population, even though they're your children. So this would give them respite, and in many cases, they would be able to live on the campus or nearby and participate to the extent that was practical in their children's lives without having it be completely consuming to them.
Or cut off. I think some parents
or cut off. That's the other side. You're right. If they put into an institution where they're not able to be engaged with their kids. So I see the whole role of family on multiple levels as being very, very appealing. And I think that this won't appeal to everybody. Nothing does.
Right.
But I think that there are a lot of parents in the metropolitan area who really want to have their kids have the best care and be able to participate in it, and know that the kids are now young adults, and then eventually they'll grow up, will have a good long-term solution that includes activities that are productive and provide a feeling of importance and value, as opposed to not having that.
Right.
And so I just was captivated by the idea. Their plan is to take an old school that's on a location that overlooks the Hudson River. So it has some dorms because it was a school for juvenile delinquent kids who needed a lot of supervision. So while these aren't juvenile delinquents, they do need a lot of supervision. And the idea of having kind of group type dorms with central areas is very appealing. So they have the homeliness of central living room, so to speak, and then kind of like a college campus, they will go to a dining hall to eat, and there'll be plenty of good food for them, and plenty of support and love and consideration. And they plan to have a hotel and other industry on the campus. The hotel, so family members could come and visit.
Right.
Grandma could come and visit, and their aunts and uncles, and they would be able to have some types of sheltered workshop where they could have industry and be productive, and lots of other activities. And it's a very large campus, like 500 acres. The thing is gigantic, and it's very beautiful. It's an hour and a half from Manhattan. So if you look at that's sort of the center of the metro area. So if you were to be, say, 3 hours, you could be in Boston, you could be at the end of Long Island, and you could be at the bottom of New Jersey. So that is a gigantic population. And when you look at the incidence of autism, this would be the first of probably many facilities in this model, especially if they're able to generate the kind of results that I think they're going to.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, that we're asking parents and individuals to make choices between a rock and a hard place. There's really no adequate long-term solution to people that have these challenges, that they're not able to be independent, yet they're not useless. They're not, meeting them where they're at. I guess that's kind of what I got from Adriana, is everybody can do something, and, what can we do to facilitate what they can do and focus on abilities, but not overlooking the physical and medical challenges that many in this population have. So yeah, you put it really well with your description of the project. Yeah, I know that's
what I got out of it. And so I wanted to be part of that. And so I tried to help them. I'm very busy trying to do what I
gather.
Do. And so I'm not able to, be actively engaged in any of the operations. So a board level position is appropriate to be able to help out. And I do have a lot of connections and to help out with that a little bit. And I'm just really interested in it. So So I volunteer on that. It's one of the things that I'm volunteering on. And I hope we'll be able to secure the needed funding to get it off the ground. My guess is that it's going to take off very rapidly once that happens. And I think the results are going to be really outstanding. And I think it'll become a model that will be replicated in lots of areas, around lots of metro areas where there.
I agree.
And I think Adriana, since it's very close to her, she has a child, Nicky, who needs to have a plan. And how about that? Someone who's willing to devote their life to finding that plan and to make that happen for their child and for the children of many other people.
Yep. Yeah, I had her on the podcast about a year ago as a guest and was just blown away, and then ended up meeting her going and meeting Tom and Chris and kind of slowly getting involved in helping with their social media a little bit and doing what I can. But yeah, just really inspired by all of the people that are involved in that. So, and the people that she is connected with on the board, this is the first interview I've done with a board member. I hope to do other interviews, but she's spoken very highly of you and all the, Chris and Tom and all the knowledge you have about coming from the IT approach as opposed to, like you said, coming up in the, traditional sense of healthcare, but kind of being outside the box and questioning these processes and procedures. Really.
Yeah. Well, that is.
Yeah.
I get to, Steve's most excellent adventure here, and this is a piece of it, and I'm just really glad to be part of it with them. I think that they're going to make a difference, and that's important to me, is to make a difference.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for sharing what you did about your grandfather and how that was a real pivotal part of your journey. That I love hearing that part.
We get to go through life. We only get to take the trip once, so we should make the most of it.
Totally agree.
I turned around a small bankrupt hospital and took it from like worst to, I don't know, worst to first, but pretty far up there, enough so that we are recognized for our leadership and commitment to quality and outcomes and patient satisfaction and financial performance. And by every metric, we have to excel. And I'm captivated by Nicky's Garden, because I think with a little funding and a little bit of time, they will figure out what it is that makes outcomes improve. Let me give you one last example of something that I did that I think is the kind of thing that I'll be able to help them with, because I'm also sort of operationally driven. So I went down, and one of the core services that small critical access hospitals have is we provide subacute rehab for patients that have been in our hospital or other hospitals as an acute patient, maybe a stroke or a major joint replacement.
Okay.
They're no longer critically ill. They're no longer acutely ill, which is less than critically ill. They are now subacutely ill, and they're just not able to go home because they're not strong enough. They've been debilitated for a long time. They tend to be disproportionately older folks that take longer to heal. They just don't bounce back as fast.
Right.
And they may have spouses who aren't really able to lift them up and care for them. They come to our facility for a couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, and we have very robust therapy and nursing to help get them up and around and build up their strength and then get them home.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the dirty little secrets is that if you fail rehab, you get placed in a nursing home for the rest of your life. And I have yet to meet the first person whose goal in life is to end up in a nursing home for the rest of their life.
That's daunting.
And so my goal is to get as many people home as I possibly can, because that's what they want. And so I went down, I talked to my nurses and my therapists, and I said, listen, I want you to come up with a measurement tool to measure the functional outcomes of our patients, and then I want you to improve them. And I think I would have had better luck using a paper wasp's nest for a piñata. They were so angry. What seemed to me was perfectly normal. We would measure it and make it better like we did everything else around here. And they said, we're already getting the best outcomes that we could have. And our patient satisfaction is through the roof because we measure that, so we know it's good. And we also know it's good because they keep bringing us baked goods, cookies, pies, cakes,
Really?
and wonderful cards telling us how happy they are. And we're working as hard as we can. Why can't you be happy when things are as good as they could be? Yeah, I'm not really a happy guy. I made them do it anyway. So they came back to me after they selected a tool, after they ran it for 6 months, and they showed me the data. And I said, well, that's, pretty good, but why can't you make it a little better? And they said, well, you see, Mr. Kelley, that means when they say Mr. Kelley, you know that's bad.
Pretty.
It's Steve, it's a colleague, we're friends, and they agree with me. It's when it's Mr. Kelley, it means headed in. They said the only thing that protects us is something called the standard of care. So if somebody has a bad outcome, then we get sued, or we may get sued. If we do get sued, the only thing that protects us and our licenses is the standard of care. And if you follow the standard of care, we don't have to have good outcomes. That's what we guarantee, is that we're going to follow the standard of care, not that you're going to be guaranteed any outcome, because we don't really know. Sometimes people get better and sometimes they don't. And I said, I think the standard of care is the floor. That's what is the minimum expectation. I am reaching for the ceiling. I am not interested in being a bottom dweller. So let's get that out of the way. I'm not talking about doing anything that's going to lower us below that standard. We should be teeing off from that. That is the foundation. Now that we got that out of the way, I believe that the 80-20 rule applies to just about everything. And that 20% of what you do is generating 80% of the results. And I want you to figure out what that is and do a little bit more of that. That's all I want you to do. We're not changing anything that you're doing, except you're going to do a little bit more of the 20% that generates most of the benefit. Well, nobody ever thinks about it like that. They are trained to do it this way. This is the way it's always been done. This is the best way. If there was a better way, we'd already be doing it that way.
Yeah.
But then when you challenge them and cause them to rethink, well, what is it that, they started looking at gait training, they started looking at a few other things.
Okay.
And then they started experimenting with it, and the outcomes got better. And a year later, we went and looked at those same metrics, and they had improved functional strength metrics, and our patients had improved by 16%. Wow. In 1 year, 16%. Wow. That's gigantic. And so what happened was our return to home rate went from 79% to 90%. So if we had 100 patients, that meant that 11 more patients avoided going to a nursing home.
That's great.
And when somebody goes to a nursing home for the rest of their life, you know how it gets paid for? It gets paid for by them first. So if they have a bank account, boom, zeroed out. If they have a house, sold on the block. They own a car, and all their possessions are all gone. And when it's down to $4,000 about, which is what it costs to bury them, then Medicaid takes over. And, people complain, our taxes are pretty high and we have to pay for all this Medicaid. Well, that's a big chunk of what you're paying for. And if we can avoid that and get people home, then guess what? Their children may have a little bit of an inheritance, and they may have some money to help their grandchildren go to college, and they don't have to be in a nursing home for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
Think about that. So I presented that at a critical access hospital meeting. We meet quarterly here in New York, all of the 18 hospitals. And I asked the other hospitals to join us with this, to try this and see if the protocols would work and see if we could improve outcomes across the state. And I got the health department to engage Stroudwater Associates, which is a very notable consulting firm based up in Portland, Maine. And they never thought about this before, but they were very interested in it, and they ran all the analytics. And guess what? Outcomes improved across the state. It was pretty amazing. And then fast forward a few years, and the University of Minnesota got a contract to measure this product in critical access hospitals and to compare it to other alternatives. And Stroudwater Associates did a lot of the analytics for them, because now they're the national experts from what they learned from us here in New York.
Really? That's so cool.
Not very nice. They think of themselves as the national experts because their analytics are so great, and they just happen to be applying it to this, but they are very good. And so in the spring, and I think it was May, down in Atlanta, the University of Minnesota, Ira Moskovitz, who's the principal researcher on that, who's doing that work,
Mhm.
invited us to join him to speak. And what was so interesting to look at his preliminary data from 200 and some hospitals from 16 states or something. I don't really
Mhm.
metrics. There's like the median line, so that's the average of the quality. And you can see all the dots around that above and below from the other hospitals. And then there's this little cluster that's up above the other group, and that's
Uh-huh.
the New York cluster.
That's great.
So I think that Nicky's Garden will be able to measure the outcomes for their residents, and they'll be able to improve those lives, and they'll be able to quantify that over time.
Mhm.
And I think that will be able to provide a very compelling story that will have lots of people want to replicate that and fund it and help support it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's a great story. I appreciate that. Have learned a lot and appreciate your time, Steve.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Jill.
Yeah. Do you have anything else that you want to discuss or promote?
No, I'm just one of those people that just likes what he does, and this is what I do.
You enjoy it.
I have a great job. I have wonderful opportunities to help people, and I like that.
I appreciate. Yeah, I love hearing about that. So positive.
Down to the end, it really comes down to one patient at a time.
One patient at a time.
One patient at a time. We have to make sure that everyone's experience is really good and better than they expect. And we haven't always done that in the area of autism because we don't have a plan for people once they get past 22.
Right. It's kind of like nobody's even been able to take the time to think that far ahead and develop it. But we have people now that are doing that, like Adriana. And
there's others too. I don't want to say that she's the only one, but she's the one that I'm working with and that I find to be so innovative, and it doesn't diminish anyone else. This is the horse in the race that I decided to be with. And it's my hope that whatever small contribution I can make will help to make it better.
Well, thanks. All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.